Okay, everyone, it's time to start our webinar. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Using Universal Designs for Learning to Enhance Information Literacy Programs online and in the library. This webinar is organized by the Information Library session and Library Services to People with Special Needs session. My name is Helen Chen. I am the Secretary of the Library Services to People with Special Needs session, one of the team leader coordinating of the two webinars and today's moderator. I'm happy to inform you that more than 420 people registered for today's webinar. With the webinar of last week under the same title, the two webinars have over 950 registrants from more than 73 countries and regions. Before starting, I would like to talk about housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded. We will post it afterward on the IFLA Library Services to People with Special Needs website. The presentation of speakers for today is already available at the same website. During the webinar, you can see Q&A of Zoom to ask questions, and please send the message or comment using Zoom chat. Live captioning is available. Click on the CC icon on the toolbar and you can change text size if you wish. Now, I would like to hand over to the chair of Library Services to People with Special Needs session, Lancy Bob, who will deliver our welcome speech. Please, Lancy. Lancy, you need to unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you, Helen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are here from. I'm Nancy Bolt, and as Helen said, I'm chair of the IFLA section on library services to people with special needs. And I want to welcome you all to our webinar, which is sponsored by two divisions. The first division is ours, and LSN, or Library Services to People with Special Needs, our mission is to improve the implementation and effectiveness of inclusive library services. We develop tools and programs to use in serving people with physical and cognitive disabilities, people in prisons, experiencing homelessness, refugees, or people in hospitals, nursing homes, and other care facilities. Our second sponsor of the webinar is the Information Literacy section, which is chaired by Dr. Min Chow. The Information Literacy section develops tools and other programs for libraries that enable people to effectively locate, evaluate, and use information that they need in this rapidly changing world. The goal is to help all library users become lifelong learners with information literacy skills. Both sections are committed to supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the role of libraries in implementing the SDGs. Our first speaker, we're going to have three speakers, two presentations, but three speakers. The first speaker is Professor Carly Spina. She is the Associate Professor and Head of Research and Instructional Services at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Professor Spina has extensive experience teaching and publishing on projects related to accessibility, inclusion, universal design, user experience, and technology. She's currently working on a book, Universal Design for Learning in Libraries, and she'll speak on universal design for learning and information literacy. Then our second presentation has two speakers. Dr. Clayton Copeland, who's the Director of Laboratory for Leadership in Equity and Diversity at the University of South Carolina School of Information Science, and Dr. Kim Thompson, also from the University of South Carolina. And Dr. Thompson is the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor at the College of Information and Communication. His titles are long. Dr. Copeland's research, teaching, and service focuses on equity of access to information for people with disabilities and other underserved populations, with an emphasis on universal design and access. Her research was among the first to offer comparative analysis of library accessibility for patrons with disabilities. And Dr. Thompson's research focuses on the relationship between information access and social inclusion. One project is on the analysis of inclusive, exclusive language in library job ads in Australia and the United States. And another project is on how to set diversity and inclusion more deeply into the library and information science curriculum. And they're going to speak on universal design for learning for inclusive teaching and learning. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. Spina.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to just share my slides with everyone and get started. Welcome, whether it's morning, as I saw many people were saying, or nighttime, as it is for me. Thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to be talking about universal design for learning and information literacy, how these two important concepts for libraries relate to one another. So to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about what universal design is. Universal design is a concept that originated in the architecture world. Most people credit Ronald L. Mace, a architect who was also himself a wheelchair user, with coining the term. And he described universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And so at its heart from the beginning was that this would be an inclusive concept, and it's about including people. And in many ways, it was focused on inclusion of people with disabilities, but it was intentionally designed from the beginning to be more than that, and simply to be the idea that design should include all, rather than being designed in a way that requires accommodations or requires special requests on behalf of those who may have needs related to disability, culture, any number of other reasons. And universal design from learning is a framework that grew out of this. And it came from research done by a number of people, but particularly by Professor David Rose and Professor Ann Meyer. And they did a lot of work about figuring out how to adapt and develop a framework from the concept of universal design broadly, specifically for designing educational environments and products that are accessible and optimal for all learners. And again, the idea is to figure out how to make education something that's also inclusive, not just for people with disabilities, but for all learners, and to find ways that you can reach all learners with a single flexible environment or product. So the universal design concept is, universal design for learning concept is divided into guidelines. And these guidelines are that you provide multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. Multiple means of engagement means that you offer variable levels, content types, and tools to appropriately challenge all learners, and to more importantly also enthusiastically capture their interest, and capture their interest in a way that is real and comes from their own interest, as opposed to merely being based on the fact that a teacher is telling them that that's something that they need to learn. And so you're developing purposeful, motivated learners. Multiple means of representation means that you present the information in multiple ways so that you're supporting learners of all different types. And that may encompass many things that we're used to seeing for accessibility purposes, such as captions on videos, or offering things in Braille. But it also includes offering support for people as they're learning new language, new terminology, symbology that they're not familiar with. For example, when you're using math symbols. Any of those types of things, you want to offer multiple forms of representation so that there's multiple ways that people can engage with the materials and multiple ways that people can learn from them, regardless of what they're most comfortable with. So that can even be something as simple as offering both text and a video. And finally, provide multiple means of action and expression. And what this means is provide more than one way for learners to demonstrate their skill, manage their own personal goals, and apply their learning so that you're developing strategic, goal-directed learners. So universal design for learning is often called UDL, is often thought of as being based in technology. And technology certainly does play a role in many of the applications of universal design for learning. But I think that it's important to realize that while technology may be central to the way that you apply these guidelines, and in fact, right now in particular, during COVID-19 with social distancing, there are many ways that our new uses of technology offer new options for thinking in a UDL-informed manner. UDL does not necessarily require technology, and merely implementing technology is not sufficient to successfully apply UDL concepts. As Dave L. Eddyburn has said, UDL is about design, and really it is a design concept. And as he says, design is fundamentally about problem solving. Instructional design is about the efficacy of learning. Central to all of these constructs is evidence of intentionality and how problems can be resolved through innovative design. Technology is simply the delivery system. So if you're at an institution that doesn't have the ability to roll out the fanciest new technology, I think sometimes it can be easy to assume that UDL does not have much to offer for you. But in reality, there's no need to have any particular piece of technology. The guidelines for universal design for learning can be applied in completely offline, technology-free classrooms. It's really about how you do the instructional design and how you think about who your learners are in doing that process. It's about design. It's not about technology alone. And I think that's also important when we're considering what technology we do decide to use. It's not enough to simply pick the latest technology. It's important to also really think carefully about the guidelines and what they have to say about the various topics. Do the technology pieces that you're adopting, do the new tools have functionality that is truly going to allow you to engage people authentically and represent your information in multiple different ways and help people to show that they've learned the information and track their own goals and become strategic learners. That really needs to be what the process is about, not simply having the latest technology system. And I think that that's something where it can be easy to throw technology at a problem. And there is a lot that technology can offer. So I don't want to make it sound as if it's not useful, but it's important to be thinking about how flexible is the technology and going through the guidelines and thinking about each of them and whether or not they're really all able to work well with this new piece of technology that you're adopting. The technology should be something that opens up the world to the learner to allow them to experience learning in many different formats and also demonstrate that they have successfully learned a concept in many different formats rather than something that closes them off or that pushes them in a particular direction that may not be successful for them and may not meet their needs. So what does UDL have to say about information literacy specifically? Well, in many ways, UDL and the concepts that it brings with it are very well suited to information literacy. It is something that can be effective for both synchronous and asynchronous content. This is something that I can equally well apply and do apply in my information literacy trainings for patrons when I'm face-to-face with them or when I'm in a Blackboard Collaborate classroom online with them this semester. And also, it's something that can and often is applied to the creation of asynchronous content, such as research guides or video tutorials. And so it really is something that can work well with all different pieces of our information literacy efforts. Because again, it doesn't matter what the technology is, it really matters more that we're thinking about engaging with people in all these different ways. And it really can work at multiple levels of technological integration. Everything from a classroom where you are drawing on a chalkboard and where you can offer options to both verbally say something and also maybe hand around a picture if you don't have any technology, or draw a picture on the board. And it can work on a computer screen where you have a tutorial that has both captions and audio descriptions and a narrator speaking. Either of those, at both ends of that spectrum technologically, Universal Design for Learning has techniques and guidelines that apply equally as much. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not something that only applies when you're doing online work. It's not something that only applies when you're doing synchronous or asynchronous work. It is really a framework that should guide all of your instructional design, broadly defined. And that means instructional design of all types. And it works really well with the ACRL framework. For those of you who have referred to this document before, the ACRL framework is focused on having students have a greater role and responsibility in creating new knowledge, in understanding the contours and the changing dynamics of the world of information, and in using information, data, and scholarship ethically. And the UDL guidelines, particularly with their focus on authentic engagement and with their focus on multiple ways of action and expression, and with their focus on having multiple different types of information and formats of information available to learners, can fit really well with these goals for the ACRL framework. So if you are someone who bases your information literacy program on the ACRL framework, it's something that really meshes well with the UDL framework. So all of us are dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. And UDL also has, as a framework, a lot to say about how we're using technology during this time and how we can better deploy that technology. So let's talk about UDL and COVID-19. And let's start with maybe the dark clouds over this process. Unfortunately, while we have adopted technology, I would argue that in many cases, libraries have done it in a way that does not necessarily help with their universal design for learning outcomes. This is very understandable. We had a rapid, unexpected change, which did not allow for time to necessarily evaluate tools in the way we would normally like to and adopt the most effective ones. People were very rushed, and often they were just finding the only tool that they could find that was free or that their institution provided, and they took what they could get. Very understandable, but it does mean that now we need to go back and really reconsider the tools that we've adopted and the way that we've set them up, and either try to have new tools or try to think about how we can creatively reimagine them using the guidelines of Universal Design for Learning, or even push vendors to change their products in ways that better fit with what we need to be able to accommodate all learners and to be able to apply these guidelines to more meaningfully create expert learners. Also now, resources are very limited. And I think that that can make some shy away from trying to adopt this framework because it is something that people automatically assume means new technology or new tools. But as I've said, there are ways going through the guidelines to do this very much on a budget or with no budget whatsoever. So I think it's important that people not automatically assume that they're not able to do this. And stress levels are high, which I think it's very important to realize. For librarians, educators, and learners, it is a time where it's difficult to switch to new options. Having said that, there are silver linings. At its core, Universal Design and Universal Design for Learning both really prioritize trying to help learners to personalize and users generally to personalize their opportunities to best fit their needs. And there are a lot of opportunities for personalization in our current system. And I think as librarians in information literacy, part of what we need to be doing is guiding people to better personalized in ways that will help them to be more effective learners and more effective researchers. Also, the adoption of new technologies can facilitate UDL if it's done in a thoughtful manner.
Last 2 minutes.
And finally, UDL offers the tools and techniques necessary to support our learners when they are remote, because it is so focused on trying to support people who may be struggling with executive function. So how can we use UDL to support our remote learners? Well, I think that we need to start, even if we have not before, intentionally building in additional support for executive function into our information literacy learning. Scaffolding these sorts of activities can be very helpful, particularly for student populations and patron populations that are under a lot of stress. I think we should also be focused on maximizing choice at every step so that we can authentically engage our learners. And I think that we should be linking out to additional information, both to aid comprehension and also to acknowledge that people are struggling to remember things at a time when they are under this stress. And I also think we can integrate more opportunities for collaboration. One of the good things about remote learning actually is that many of the tools we're using now allow for collaboration. We should also offer advice and training on tools for managing resources. We've thrown a lot of new technology at patrons, and it's important that we scaffold that for them and we help them to learn how to use these tools. And libraries have a great role that they can start filling in supporting remote learners in this way. And then focus on the Universal Design for Learning guidelines when evaluating tools and your instructional design. Make sure that as a library, you're adopting these and you have a plan for how you're going to use them in the evaluation process, when you're evaluating tools, when you're evaluating designs, and when you're doing your own instructional design.
Last 1 minute.
And finally, I think that it's important in applying UDL to your day-to-day learning that you try to remember that you want to integrate multimedia, test anything that you will be offering technologically for assistive device compatibility, integrate scaffolding wherever possible, whether through linking out to other resources or providing built-in additional support, and offer progress monitoring options, such as the ability to check off activities when they're completed to help students to keep track of where they are. And I want to end by saying that, as said in this great new book, Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning by Professor Fitzgerald, the standard does not change because of situations or hardships. The standard is communicated and the road to reach the standard is paved with flexibility. And I think this really speaks to our current moment. COVID-19 doesn't mean that we should change our standards. It means that we need to offer flexibility and help each student to find their path towards the outcomes that they need to reach. So as you're working with students, try to remember that there are many paths and help them to find the right path for them. And I think there'll be questions at the end, but you can also contact me if you would like after the presentation. There's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Spinner, for the great presentation. I really enjoy it. Thank you. Then I would like to introduce our next two speakers, Dr. Clayton Copeland and Dr. Kim Thompson. They will talk about universal design for learning for inclusive teaching and learning. Dr. Copeland and Dr. Thompson, the floor is yours.
Well, I need to take the floor for just a minute. I think some people came in late and don't realize that we would like you to put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. That's the way we'll answer them. We're not going, I will be reading the questions and asking them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, thank you all, everyone. It is a pleasure and privilege to be with you all this evening. I'm Dr. Clayton Copeland, and I'm joined by Dr. Kim Thompson to discuss universal design for learning for inclusive teaching and learning.
Clayton, I don't, can you all see the slides?
No, no.
Okay. Let's try again.
Yes. Okay, we can see it now. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So universal design for learning, for inclusive teaching and learning. So we'd like to talk with you a bit this evening about what universal design for learning is and why it is important for all students, those with and without disabilities.
I'm sorry, Clayton, could you click the present again? Some of the word is getting cut off.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Today's learners and learning environments are filled with diversities and physical abilities, physical challenges, varying ages, skill sets, experiences, learning preferences, strengths, varying cultures, learning styles, and approaches to integrating information into our knowledge schema, languages, perspectives, senses, and even religions. Universal design for learning, as Dr. Spina said, universal design for learning is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. We have for you here some tools and resources that we would like to share from our University of South Carolina's Center for Teaching Excellence. There are some accessibility guides and tutorials, recognizing that in today's learning environments, we are responsible for creating materials and content delivery that are not only accessible for, but usable by all of our students. So you'll note in the slides to come that we have focused specifically on certain demographics in the population and specific strategies that can be employed to increase accessibility for those populations. Our challenge for all of you as we go through this content is to ask you to think about, in the spirit of universal access and design, what other populations and groups these same accommodations can support.
Yes, Clayton, would you be willing to right click and turn off the auto captioning? Thank you. So this is me, isn't it? So we wanted to talk about, as Dr. Copeland just said, about, I think we have 4 different groups that we offer suggestions of things, actual things you can do to increase the usability of the resources that you have. The first, we'd like to apply concepts of UDL and inclusive teaching and learning to learners with visual limitations. Microsoft Word has a style formatting feature to it, and when you type something, everything you type is typed within a style. If you type an entire document simply in just the normal setting, is what it's default called, and then you're putting things in bold and underlining things, and on your page it looks like you have headings and subheadings, but to a screen reader it just seems like it's all the same font. There are no subheadings, there are no bold, there are no changes to show where the screen reader needs to go. So using Microsoft Word style formatting will allow a screen reader to read it better. So someone reading it with a screen reader can tab through the different subheadings and navigate the page much better. So if you, and all of those things, as she said, the Center for Teaching Excellence URL, and if you do just a general search for centers of teaching excellence at other universities, there will be guides for how to understand that better. We're just going to give an overview as opposed to an actual training in how to do it. The next is alt text for images. Same idea. When you have an image on your page, and someone who's sighted can see it, but someone who is using a screen reader, that doesn't exist. And sometimes the picture is quite important. Maybe it's a model that we're showing our students or faculty, whomever we are training. And so having alt text is just a right click and then a thing comes up on the side that says, when you click alt text and you say image of model or model of information seeking or whatever your model is. So you just kind of describe it so that the screen reader can read that and the person who cannot see the image can hear what the image is and they don't lose that content. The next is uploading both PDF and doc versions of your resources. Sometimes we think, oh, a PDF holds the design very nicely. It looks very nice. And so we might only upload a PDF, but some screen readers can have difficulty reading a PDF. Whereas 20 years ago when I started teaching, the PDFs actually read better than the doc. And so having both of them up is good practice because then you allow listeners or readers with different needs to see it. Another thing is with the docs, maybe someone has visibility is pretty good, but the font is difficult for them to read. Or they like to have a dyslexic font. And so they can then select it if it's a doc and they can change it to a dyslexic font or to a different font, maybe change the size of the font to be able to read it better. They can manipulate it for their use. So again, as Dr. Spinelli said, and as Dr. Clayton just said, being aware of the users and the different needs that they might have, thinking what might somebody like, what would make it a better experience for them, and then making decisions based on that. The last on this slide is the sans serif font. So that would be Arial and Calibri, which is what we have used on this slide. If you can see the slide, if you can't see the slide, it's just the kind that do not have the little lines at the top and the bottom of the letters. It's just research shows that it is easier to read a sans serif font on a slide. And so on the slides that's what we've used, font, and then but in a written document, in a paper print document, you want to have the font set at least at 12-point font for documents. And if you have slides much bigger than that, of course, you try to have just a few bullets on the page so it's not difficult to see the image, the content on the page. Next slide, please. And then this is continuing about visual limitations. You want to be sure your font is black or a very dark color as opposed to color coding content. For example, you might say, have a couple of quotes and think, oh, it would look very nice if one quote was in red and one was in green and one was in purple. That shows that the purple one is always this person that I'm citing, the green is always that person, and the red is always this. But for someone who's colorblind or has visual limitations, there may be no color there. And so your color coding, which means something, doesn't mean anything to the reader. And so having black or very dark fonts is a much better practice. Also be aware of spacing and layout on the screen or on the page. Again, making sure things are not too crowded on the page and that things are structured in a way that a screen reader will read it from top to bottom or with tabs to get through the content. And the way you order your slide panes as well, making sure the content, like Dr. Spinelli said, having a structure to it, and sometimes even a table of contents at the beginning of a document, a small table of contents that allows people People who are on the autism spectrum perhaps need that to be able to figure out what the different content, the order of the content, and it can help with comprehension. Also, if you're using Microsoft Office, there is a feature called Check Accessibility, which can check the access that you have in there. In Blackboard, there is a patch that some organizations have that check that. There are some other software that you can use to check accessibility, but if all you have is Microsoft Office, you can use the Check Accessibility feature. And if you just go into a search in Microsoft Office and say accessibility, it will show you what features you have. But you have to realize that it's not going to be perfect. It's going to give you hints. It's going to give you suggestions based on the algorithms that it has. But knowing this about the fonts and about the spacing and the layout and how you see it on the page, you will need to make sure that it still is accessible. But it is a very helpful resource. Dr. Copeland, anything you'd like to add to that?
I would just say again to reiterate that the built-in accessibility checkers are very useful and very helpful, particularly for someone who is just beginning to learn the basics of document or presentation accessibility. However, those checkers do not catch every error. And so it's very important to use the tools such as those that we've provided from the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of South Carolina for fundamentally learning the practices of making documents accessible and using this as a checkpoint, not as a place of reliance of if the accessibility checker says it passes, then it's a fully accessible document, because it may well not be.
Thank you. And I'll look for that URL and I'll post it in the chat so people can have that link as well while Dr. Copeland takes us to the next slide.
So in terms of applying UDL and inclusive teaching and learning to learners with hearing limitations, some general practices that can be very helpful would be recording video lectures for viewing, such that those materials can be reviewed as many times as necessary, as determined by the individual learner. Also, recording the lectures for viewing allows for captioning of the content such that folks can follow along. Providing copies of slides and notes such that students can follow along with the content can be very helpful in reinforcing key points, or if terminology is missed verbally in verbal communication or through hearing, then the student is able to pick up some of that terminology and so forth from the slides and the notes. It also provides a predictable structure for the delivery of the content. Providing closed captioning whenever possible is imperative. If closed captioning is not available, then allowing for transcription is a second best to that, and offering a detailed handout or outline of presentation slides that follows the same order of the presentation can be very useful. In situations where it is possible, offices of disability services may also determine to assign someone to take notes for other students in the class. Trying to have a video of one's face when lecturing with high resolution, particularly if closed captioning is not available, can be very useful. You'll also note that I have used a red lipstick to provide an outline of my lips, and that is to aid in reading one's lips if that is possible and comfortable for both the instructor and the class of students. Speaking slowly and with a clear tone is very important. It's very significant to remember that shouting or speaking in a louder tone is not going to aid someone in hearing the information, but rather to maintain a consistent tone that is slow and offering the opportunity to repeat information as necessary is also a useful strategy.
Thank you. And Nancy just posted in our chat that PowerPoint allows subtitles as well. And that they were, you saw them earlier, they were the large subtitles behind the subtitles that are being live captioned. And they're not bad. They get better all the time. Dr. Copeland, would you say?
Absolutely. And the same goes with transcribing our lectures or having auto captioning of materials that we are recording. For example, if we have auto captioning in YouTube or one of our technologies, it's very important that we do engage in editing for accuracy, particularly for discipline-specific terminology. But we can see that with time, these technologies and their accuracy are improving, and they offer important opportunities not only for the students for whom they were originally intended, but perhaps also for other students who may be learners in our classrooms. For example, closed captioning was originally established for those with hearing impairments, but it can be very useful for second language learners as well as people with certain processing challenges, a little slower to process content, and the ability to both read and hear content simultaneously can be very important for those processing challenges or even simply differing learning styles in processing information.
Thank you. Those are that's very good. I appreciate that. So the next slide we have is applying concepts of UDL and inclusive teaching and learning to learners with mobility limitations. So sometimes in a face-to-face class, you may not even notice that someone has a mobility limitation, or it could be that it's pretty taken care of. They maybe roll their wheelchair in and they just sit there and they participate as any other student. But this may create barriers in the online learning environments, particularly if their mobility limitations are because of arthritis of some sort or inability to have hand control. What are some other mobility limitations, Dr. Copeland, that might affect?
So with mobility limitations, one other consideration that we do need to take into account, even with something like handwriting, is stamina and speed. Someone could have a mobility challenge that is impacted by something that we'll all experience across the lifespan. For example, arthritis. But with time, someone may have strong writing skills, but over time the level of endurance falls. And so having extra support in that process and realizing that handwriting may not always be at the same speed as it would be for a learner without a mobility challenge. So keeping that in mind and offering things like note takers, but also providing outlines of lecture notes, allowing, if possible, if it's in a face-to-face classroom, allowing the student to have a recording of the lecture such that they can go back and review content at a later time. Realize that just as they may have slower handwriting speed, they may have slower typing speeds, and so may need a larger monitor or adaptive keyboards, a rollerball mouse, or speech to text or text to speech commands in order to interact with the technologies.
And I think it's also important to note here that the idea of hidden or latent or invisible disabilities, because just because someone, you don't see what their disability is, it doesn't mean that they don't have a disability, that they do need accommodation. And sometimes asking for it can be, they could be shy about it, or they just don't know how to ask well for an accommodation. And so just being aware that there could be invisible disabilities, and then if you see someone who seems to need a bit more help, just being a bit more patient with that and maybe asking questions of how you can accommodate, as Dr. Spina said, to make sure that everyone has full access to all of the materials in the best way that's suited for their needs.
And I would like to add there too, Dr. Thompson, I'm glad that you said that, making sure that they're suited to the individual student's needs. It's very important that while we can put forth strategies and practices that would typically be helpful, no one knows their needs more than an individual themselves. They have this lived experience with the challenges, and they know their needs best of all. And so working with them as an advocate and saying, how can I help and what can we do together to give you the best learning experience possible is really important.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So some other things that we can do, the second slide is about mobility limitations as well. So some other strategies we can use are to, again, recordings and transcripts of online meetings can help, because then instead of having to note take, which can be laborious, and if they're slow, they may not hear the next thing because they're still trying to think of how to write the previous information, it can be helpful for students with mobility limitations. Again, having a designated note taker in an online meeting or an online session that you have, and reinforcing verbal communications with written communication. So if you have an engagement, maybe a reference interview or a bibliographic instruction or some sort of instruction, and when you finish, maybe sending an email out to all the participants saying, these are the 6 things that we covered. If you have any questions, then please communicate back. Opening the pathway for communication. Also, if you might have a meeting with someone, maybe teaching them how to use a research database, or teaching them how to ask an information question. And so then an email again saying, this is kind of what we went over, here are more resources that you can look up, could be useful, because it is difficult sometimes to capture everything while you're listening, especially if you're at all nervous or if it's completely new vocabulary and you're a little shy about asking someone to define some terms that they might not be familiar with. Reinforcing with verbal communications can be very helpful, because then with written communication can be very helpful, because then they can look up any terms that they didn't understand perhaps. All right.
And then applying concepts of UDL for learners with neurodiversities, recognizing that whether it is with neurodiversity or any other challenge, we can have comorbidity at any point. among our students. And so particularly for our learners with neurodiversities, being explicit about how to ask for clarification and understanding and giving specifics on how students may do that can be very important. Establishing a predictable structure such that students know what the classroom expectations are, whether those are online or face-to-face, and where they can go to seek help.
Last 2 minutes.
For example, one strategy is to set up a questions about assignments discussion forum within the online learning system, such that students can ask questions, but they can also receive responses from the instructor or the instructional team, as well as from their colleagues, because we may find that they share a similar learning style with a colleague, and someone can share a different approach to processing the information that is helpful to an individual.
Dr. Clayton, could you explain what neurodiversities means?
Sure. So neurodiversities could relate to any number of characteristics that someone may have, whether that's difficulty with processing information or interacting with the social environment. And perhaps Dr. Thompson would like to elaborate as well.
Right. So neurodiversities could be that you maybe are on the autism spectrum or have any kind of just diversity or difference that affects how you learn or how you process things, which can be a great advantage in the learning community. It could be that you focus very well, and so you have a very good memory, but maybe have difficulty with logic or with the critical part. It could be many different effects to your learning experience.
And so again, providing a clear structure, whether that is through physical interactions or through subheadings in documents, providing predictability, offering multiple opportunities for reinforcement, and for students to be able to ask and answer questions. Also with neurodiversities, being very clear about expectations for behavior in class, on the discussion boards, and with other communications. And one strategy that's very effective is scaffolding assignments. And so perhaps breaking assignments down into smaller parts such that pieces of an assignment are completed strategically, and then new content is covered. The next portion of the assignment is completed.
So just in essence, we want to repeat what Professor Spina said about if it's good for some learners, it is almost definitely going to be helpful for others. And accessibility helps ensure meaningful interactions and stronger learning outcomes overall for the course. I think we're out of time. I think the next slide is a question that someone asked, so we'll turn the time over to Nancy, and if we have time to answer that question, we will.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation. Dr. Copeland and Dr. Thompson, thank you. So it's the Q&A session as mentioned by Dr. Thompson. So Nancy, please.
Okay, we do have some questions. The first one is UDC taught very much in library schools. Like that, and actually we have Dr. Spina, you can turn on your video too, because we'd like all three of you to comment on these. So what about UDL taught in library schools? Is it and should it?
I can start, I suppose. So in my experience, I don't personally, I did not learn about it in library school. I also did a master's degree in education, and that's where I learned more about universal design for learning. I think that it should be, and I think that more generally, even when you're taking classes that are focused on librarians who will be leading information literacy sessions and will be teaching, they still don't really go enough into pedagogy and the sort of frameworks for accessibility like UDL and how to teach, in my opinion. So I think it would be great if programs did more of that, but right now it's confined to a few electives at some select schools, but not all in my experience.
Okay. Dr. Clayton or Dr. Thompson, you want to comment?
Yeah, Dr. Clayton.
I would say that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to continue developing awareness around UDL. We do have a long way to go, as Professor Spina has said, but I have seen great strides in recent years as well, and hope to continue to see a commitment that arises out of events such as those we are having today, by creating awareness and opportunities for people to take this back to our respective classrooms and universities and advocate for the difference in the learning outcomes that these strategies can make for our students.
I think it's hard to see benefits of the coronavirus, but one of them might be a better understanding or more advocacy for making sure that everybody can participate online. So let's hope that might be it might be an outcome that library schools take over. Another one was, when you say universal, does this mean all types of libraries in all countries? And how flexible are these guidelines? Some of these might be, in less developed countries, some of these guidelines may be difficult. And a second question that was similar to that is, in developing countries without technology, either on the teaching side or the learning side, what kind of modifications are possible to make to still help people learn information literacy skills?
Sure. So as I tried to allude to a little bit in my presentation, though the guidelines are also often focused on in a technology way, a technology focused manner, that doesn't have to be the case. And I shared in the chat the website that was developed by CAST, one of the organizations that researches UDL, to give more details about the guidelines. And many of them can be implemented with or without technology. So to take an example, if you're building an online research guide, you might use text and you might integrate a video and you might also integrate pictures. But if you don't have any of that technology and you're teaching in a classroom, you might still be able to have a full implementation of the UDL guidelines by offering, lecturing about a topic and then also showing images, even if those are just printed out images or a book that you hand around the classroom. And a lot of the guidelines are also more about how the students interact. So rather than having students write a paper at the end, you could offer the option that they do a presentation or write a paper, or even maybe develop a skit that they all do together. And that would be implementing a lot of the action and motion guidelines. It would be potentially the engagement guidelines, and none of it would require any technology beyond a piece of paper. So there really is flexibility here, even though often people talk about technology. I think you don't have to get caught up in the technology. You can read the guidelines and think creatively about, well, without technology, what are some other ways I might be able to reach students in these new ways?
Dr. Lorraine Roy, who's one of our participants, and thank you, Dr. Roy, says that that UDL is taught in the LSI program at University of Texas. It's called Library Instruction and Information Literacy. And they also offer a workshop to the entire program. And Dr. Thompson has added that they are advocating for it at lease. And a lease is the, see if I get this right, Association of Library and Information Science Education. Is that right? Okay. So one way to move this forward is for those of you who are professors, or those of you even who are not, is to advocate that library schools begin to teach this, these skills, so that, because one of the things that struck me as I was listening is that we're talking about this in terms of information literacy for learning, or I'm sorry, universal design for learning, but it really applies to anyone who's doing anything online to get information across to people. I mean, it's not just if you're teaching information literacy, it would be the same as if you were actually monitoring or moderating a book club that you want people to participate in. So these are really very general principles that apply to a much larger field. Helen's come on, so I'm guessing she's going to say it's time to close.
I have suggestions. Yeah, I think this webinar is a very good beginning point of having a better understanding of universal designs for learning. So we will from here build up more resources for everyone, and make information accessible for all. So also students today are academics. So may we invite them all, you all right here, to provide us more, for example, your articles or paper related to universal design learning, especially on the delivery of information literacy program. So we can upload your articles or paper to our library services to people with special needs website, and make the webinar web page more resourceful for everyone.
Yes, thank you. Those are good suggestions. So with that, I'm going to close it. Would you like to close your screen sharing, Dr. Copeland? So I'd like all of the planning committee to come back on, so I can be sure and thank them. Min Chow, the chair of information literacy. Masako Nomura, who did my role in the first webinar, and she's the past president of library services to people with special needs. Helen, our tech person, and currently secretary of LSN, and then I'm chair of LSN. And also a thank you to Monica, our captioner. So we appreciate all of that. And thank you so much, participants, for joining us, and our wonderful speakers. That was a really remarkable presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Yes, time to say goodbye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you everyone
Helen,
for
you wanna
coming, and thank you
down?
to the panelists.